Continued coexistence of such variegated structures would be counterproductive to the construction of a homogenized nation. Turkey's leaders passed the Unification of Education Act in March 1924, and it's Tevhid-i Tedrisat Kanunu for. This was a profound change from the previous state of affairs, as it brought the contents and the delivery of all formal education in Turkey under the exclusive control of the Ministry of Education. The law closed down all schools affiliated with Islamic institutions and decreed that foreign missionary schools, which had been operating in the country since the mid-1800s, to stop proselytizing. Finally, even at the expense of flouting the provisions of the Lausanne Treaty, it imposed strict controls over schools pertaining to non-Muslim communities, whose numbers in the population had already been radically reduced in the aftermath of World War I and the War of Independence. Central to the implementation of these reforms was the IPC, the Instruction and Pedagogy Committee, and the familiar Turkish name, as you will, those of you who speak Turkish will remember, is Talim Terbiye Umum Müdürlüğü, which continues to have a strong influence on shaping the pedagogical choices and educational policies. To this day, IPC is the sole authority formulating the curricula, overseeing the contents, design, and production of textbooks, suggesting teaching methods, and providing continuing education courses for teachers. Less acknowledged, but equally importantly, the IPC also determined the spatial and material dimension of the pedagogical techniques for elementary and middle school students, a critical period during which children develop lasting ideas about selfhood in relation to a community of peers, individual and cooperative work habits, and the fundamental skills that are valued in society. The sampling of exercises below will illustrate how central to the students' closely monitored participation in the material culture of the Republic was to their passage from childhood to citizenship. Let me start with an iconic exercise of spatial representation designed to help students imagine and visually internalize Turkey's landmarks by teaching them how to draw a map of the country from memory. And let me tell you, I was 8 or 9 and my mom did this and I was just blown away by her ability. I cheated because we had plastic templates by then. Rather than perfectly precise reproductions as one would see in an atlas, here the emphasis was on acquiring a clear mental image of the country through repeated practice. Students could start with simpler geometric forms such as rectangles and triangles to generate the more complex geographic forms, not unlike the construction of still life drawings. Importantly, though, while the latter was an abstraction of actual objects that were within everyone's reach, and the map was the representation of an abstraction of an entity that nobody ever actually saw or held. The exercise was developed by Hakkı İzzet, a ceramicist by training, who taught mold construction at Gazi Teachers College. There are important parallels between İzzet's specialization and the map exercise, since both require translation between abstract visions and tangible forms. Unlike ceramics, however, Turkey is a discrete freestanding object with a clearly demarcated boundaries separating it from everything around it did not exist outside the imagination. Using the above-mentioned artistic techniques intended for the representation of physical objects for the representation of Turkey as a whole, despite the obvious logical flaws of the rationale, facilitated just the kind of mental extrapolations Republican educational policymakers wanted students to make, implicitly setting a mental default about the shape of the country and its inviolable integrity. The progeny of the logo map exercise, as with other cartographic skills, may be traced to the expansion of the modern state apparatus in the 19th century, especially in Western and Central Europe. Modernizing states expanded universal education so as to produce and reproduce literate and numerate citizens loyal to and familiar with a shared geography, a training that in turn was expected to bolster the inherently territorial claims of a nation-state. In addition to recognizing and constructing the logo map, teaching students to read and navigating a map, and to locate themselves, the geographic features, natural resources, major settlements, production centers, transportation hubs, and national landmarks became common to the national curricula of most modernizing states. As many of you here would know very well, the emergence and development of these pedagogical and ideological goals dovetailed conveniently with the growth of cheap mass printing and modern map production technologies. The latter made equipping classrooms with the maps and textbooks needed to conduct desired drills more broadly possible, including, as we learn from Benjamin Fortna's work, in the Ottoman Empire. To help students acquire the mental agility to move between physical reality and its representations, and understand the relationship between their everyday settings and their cartographic abstractions, the IPC recommended complementing these exercises, usually conducted indoors, with practical projects and field trips. The committee noted that what was learned experientially had more staying power in children's minds, adding that learning on site through observation and praxis would refine their perspicacity, and providing concrete examples would make elusive concepts easier to grasp. Hence, for example, the standard manual for elementary school teachers suggested using the vicinity of school buildings as teaching tools, and that all subjects from math to science, history, art, and even Turkish language stood to benefit from field trips. Recommended exercises especially emphasized using the Republican Public Works for this purpose. A striking example featured third grade students in the Izmir Bayraklı Elementary School, here seen supervised by their teacher during a math field trip. In the photograph, a group of children appeared kneeling on the ground determining the width and length of railroad tracks. According to the caption, the field trip was an excellent example of how units of length could be taught hands-on. Of course, if the goal were to merely teach the units of length by measuring the sizes of everyday objects, that certainly could have been done in less dangerous places. However, given the IPC's emphasis on instilling a sense of belonging to a larger geographic unit beyond what was readily visible or accessible, it is possible to think of other motives. Railroad construction was by all accounts one of the largest and most important infrastructural undertakings of the Republic and was considered vital to national integration. Bringing school children to see the railroad and watch its tracks disappear into the horizon allowed them to see for themselves that this iron thread indeed stretched out and connected them to their compatriots in distant parts of the country, constituting in effect a vast iron web. By physically touching the rails, the students were also touching a part of the abstract railroad map that appeared in their textbooks, and by implication connecting the real with the representational. Arguably, the most spectacular intersection of pedagogy with the built environment occurred during commemorative ceremonies, celebrating milestones of Turkey's transition from empire to republic. These were effectively performative history lessons that wove urban space and official narrative together symbolically by incorporating prescribed routes and landmarks into a parade route with collective rituals at designated sites. At the time, as part of centrally conceived urban improvement program, Republican downtowns exhibited certain recognizable characteristics which facilitated the planning and standardization of pageantry as well. Despite variations due to topography and existing built fabric at each location, and constraints imposed by the state's limited material resources and technical personnel, these town centers featured a clustering of institutional and administrative buildings, such as the governor's seat, military headquarters, state-run banks, and the Halkavide party-run community center, and they were typically positioned around a small park or square anchored by an Atatürk monument, which also constituted the terminus point of these collective performances. And here we have a mapped example from Muğla, where you can see the Atatürk monument, the gathering around it, and then that's the circle in that map. And you can see these two major roads are actually separating the new developments in town from the older developments. This was where teachers delivered public history lectures to the students and gathered crowds, and local government and military officials crowned the event with exalting speeches. Importantly, the participants, especially the students, were made aware that elsewhere in the country other children too were simultaneously partaking in similar performances with a shared material culture. Hence, albeit ephemeral, these were memorable events intended to bolster a sense of unity through collective performances of Turkishness. Experienced from the obverse, however, these exercises exacerbated the alienation felt by those who did not conform to the description of the ideal citizen, that is, ethnically Turkish, Sunni, progressive, as in open to westernization, and submissive to authority. From representations to reenactments, the same spaces and spatial practices that had been enlisted to channel students' loyalties toward the idea of one unified nation on a shared land also exposed very real cleavages that were too wide to overlook. Refracted through the prisms of ethnicity, religion, and geographic region, they inflected children's sense of belonging and contributing to the production in the long term of different modes and grades of citizenship. Elazığ, a small town and the administrative seat of the eponymous province in eastern central Turkey, provides a revealing site for locating the limits of state capacity and narratives of national unity, since so many of its children stood at the margins of ideal citizenship. Although not an actual battleground in World War I, Elazığ had been hard hit by the loss of its large Armenian population during the 1915 genocide, which left a profound impact on its demographic makeup, social life, and economy. Especially in the early years of the Republic, traces of Armenian life and culture were everywhere to be seen, in abandoned institutions, factories, and homes, much to the consternation of Republican officials because such vestiges undermined nationalist claims to exclusive historic ownership of the land. Also, Elazığ was located just south of Dersim, an impregnable and mountainous province home to a Zaza and Kermanj-speaking Alevite Kurdish population, who historically had a semi-autonomous existence and resisted the assimilationist policies of the Ankara government as far as the country's leaders were concerned. Dersimis were considered suspect for having offered shelter to, and in some cases mixed with, the fleeing Armenians. Especially in the 1930s, as the government tried to bring Dersim under control through increasingly violent means, culminating in a bloody massacre, Elazığ, historically a military stronghold, served as a base of operations. Eventually, Dersim's name was Turkicized into Tunceli, and the entire province was turned into a restricted zone, Memnu Mıntıka, and many of its inhabitants were forcefully deported to other provinces. This brief local history alone reveals why the discrepancy between the idealized curriculum and the facts on the ground snaps into such sharp focus in Elazığ. Now let me turn to the nation-building exercises I covered earlier, namely commemorative ceremonies, infrastructure appreciation, and logomat memorization. When we examine how these unfolded in Elazığ's contentious context, we can recognize that imposing a unified sense of nationhood while surrounded by the physical traces and surviving witnesses of continued ethno-religious violence required the suspension of this belief. Thus, while on paper commemorative ceremonies closely conformed to the standard national program, the readings they offered were indexed to the observer's position within Elazığ's social landscape and access to its collective memory. In Elazığ, students, especially older ones partaking in the ceremonies, knew, as well as the government officials leading them, that while they were publicly venerating Turkey's foundation myths, clashes just outside city limits were threatening the tenuous union the Republic's founding fathers had forged. In Elazığ, components of the parade route such as the Elazığ Middle School was actually the German missionary school for Armenians, and the state orphanage, which is celebrated as a gift from Turks who emigrated to the United States, was actually the home of its most prominent Armenian industrialists, all of whom perished during the genocide. And at the Halkevi, the party-run community center had been built out of mostly Armenian gravestones hauled from nearby Harput. Although nowhere in their textbooks there was a mention of this fraught history of post-genocidal appropriation. In Elazığ, the Atatürk Monument, culmination point of all ceremonies, was also used for shaming captured Kurdish leaders, underscoring their disenfranchisement. These so you can see how near these places actually were. I mean, this is basically the core of these performances. So going back to what you were saying about the whole place being an open, classroom without walls, the city center then is transformed into a classroom. These public performances of Turkishness, which edited the past and sorted and ranked the populace, resonated painfully with the daily experiences of marginalization experienced by schoolchildren who fell outside the norm. The most detailed evidence comes from Kurdish girls at the nearby Girls' Institute, whose students were constant fixtures at every official occasion. The institute was effectively a microcosm of social stratification. In addition to the typical recruits from families of civil servants and Elazığ elites, which would be typical for any girls' institute, of which there were 14 at the time when this institute was set up, it had several boarders, all of whom were Kurdish, and many of them had been severed forcefully from their families and to be Turkicized by coercion. Here, language and ethnicity, coupled with visible signs of abject poverty, served as painful markers of a disparity felt by those on either side of the divide. For example, upon arrival, the girls' clothes were confiscated and burned, their hair was shaved to remove the head lice, and they were quarantined for days before they could join other students in their distinctive government-issue uniforms. They were not allowed to speak Kurdish among themselves and were too afraid to do so even when they were alone. In the common areas of the school, like the dining hall, students self-segregated by ethnicity, acting out their designated stations within its social order, with the daughters of civil servants as role models, demonstrating civilized manners by example to Kurdish girls, and Kurdish girls emulating as if they could bring nothing to this exchange. And here I actually want to underline something that we might want to discuss, because in the case of the schools that we heard about, the residential schools, they're all for native children, First Nations children. In Elazığ, actually, there was a mix of children, which actually kind of creates a different kind of dynamic in space. And so I think that's worth discussing. Even when implemented in the name of health and hygiene or advancement through education, these measures scarred them for life, permanently marking them as other. A similar divergence of perspective applied to how trains figured into children's imagination. Unlike their counterparts elsewhere, who learned to take pride in the rail network for reinforcing territorial integrity, regional connectivity, and market consolidation, children in Elazığ learned to look at the train with a mix of awe and unease. As the network expanded inland, train service arrived in Elazığ in 1934. But the itineraries were decided by military priorities at the expense of practical or commercial considerations. The trains brought troops to Elazığ to fight in Dersim, and here's actually parading troops after the first incursion into Dersim, and carried the casualties back accompanied by corteges of mourners. The train station was also where the Dersimis, who were sent off to exile, and whereas the short-sighted and ill-planned process got rolling, grieving families, widowed women, crying children congregated, cold, hungry, and exposed, clutching their few belongings, a far cry from the pride and promise of the iron web. Evacuating Dersim was tantamount to boring a hole in the middle of the logo map. An inaccessible piece of the national territory bereft of its people, restricted even to government officials without a permit, a hole, the existence of which, however, would remain largely unknown to children and adults elsewhere. And here's a military map of the Forbidden Zone. Conversely, the decision to break up extended families and to restrict them from moving outside their designated placement made the rest of Turkey just as inaccessible to the deportees as Dersim was. The country was large, but their leash was short. The long and humiliating journey before being hurled off at some random village where primitive dogs barked, left an indelible mark on the Dersim-born Cemal Süreya, one of the most eloquent Turkish language poets who was 8 during the deportation. That they should travel in windowless boxcars littered with animal feces was all the more poignant in light of the widespread aspersion that Kurds had tails, implying that they were less than human. For Cemal Süreya and fellow deportee children who did not speak Turkish and could not easily fit in their new environments, the question of identity and belonging would linger for a lifetime. For Cemal Süreya, even in the face of such acclaim as a poet and professional recognition as the general director of the National Mint. In this paper, I tried to examine how space in the hands of early Republican educational policymakers became a primary, if relatively under-examined, medium for the production, and in the long-term reproduction of a unified national identity. I have chosen Elazığ, Dersim to critique this process because they posed an almost perfect geographical and demographic antipode to the ideals promoted by Turkey's founding fathers and policymakers tasked with articulating their vision. The exercises I selected indeed were intended to demonstrate the instrumentality of space and spatial practices from the provision most obviously of the sites of instruction to the methods of instruction and to the actual contents of instruction. By the same token, space was also the very medium through which difference was communicated and exclusion was imposed. Every discrepancy between representation and experience reality on the ground, as we have seen, could trigger further refractions and fragmentations. Exile, confinement, surveillance, marginalization, and forced conversions were formative, situated, and performed experiences, producing different modes and grades of citizenship. Although they were experienced in various degrees by children elsewhere in the country, including in Ankara, the nation's capital, they were felt more painfully, and divisively in Eastern Turkey, and by children who remained outside this ideal definition.